Okay, now let's continue to discuss this chapter on international trade. So remember we basically uh, talk about this nice story about a country which is called Iceland. And this country is thinking about some changes in its trade policy. To be more specific, we talked about this country would want to open its trade with the outside world, and we examined how would quantity and price would change, and then more importantly, we examined how would consumer surplus and producer surplus would change. And then we consider the effect of the tariff, right? How the tariff would affect the price and how the tariff would affect consumer surplus, producer surplus, and government revenue. And the basic result is as follows. So basically, we will discuss these lessons for trade policy and to review what kind of basic results we have obtained from the last lecture. First, if the government allowed Icelandics to import and export textiles, what would happen to the price of textiles and the quantity of textiles sold in the domestic textile market? So the answer here is if the trade is allowed, the Icelandic price of textiles would be driven to equal to the world price. So basically, we have two kinds of scenarios, right? So the first is the world price is lower, right? So let's say this is the world price. Okay, let me call world price as PW, right? Obviously, W refers to world. And then this is the domestic price. Let's call this PD, right? Domestic price. So after the country opens its trade, then what we would say is the market price in this domestic market would just become PW, right? So the market price would be exactly equal to the world price. And obviously the same result applies if the world price is larger than the domestic price. Right? So if the world price is larger, it's here. Then after the country opens up, what you would see is the price would increase to this world price. Right? Okay, let's look at the second lesson. Who would gain from free trade in textiles, and who would lose? And would the gains exceed the losses? First, the clear answer is the gain or the total gain will always be larger than the total loss. So there is net gain from trade. And depending on whether the country becomes a exporter or a importer, we will have different answers on whether consumers will gain or producers will gain, right? So basically, if the country becomes a exporter, then the domestic price will increase, and then producers will gain, and consumers will lose. If the country becomes an importer, then the price would fall, and consumers will gain, and producers will lose, right? Again, what I would see is just use this very simple demand and supply curve. So let's say we have the domestic demand and domestic supply curve look like this. And let's say the world price is given by this red line, right? And what you would see is after the country opens up, the country would become a importer, right? Because the outside world has a lower price. In this case, you can see that the previous or were the consumers' surplus before international trade was given by this little triangle, right? And after the country opens up, consumer surplus is given by this larger triangle, right? Because this is the new price, right? So in this case, you can see that if the country becomes an importer, consumers will benefit. And you could also examine producers' surplus, right? So let's see how producers' surplus would change. Basically, before the country opens up, producer's surplus is given by this larger triangle, right? Because again, producer surplus is really the area between the price, that is the domestic price, and the supply curve. And after the country opens up, now we have this world price. In this case, again, the producer surplus is given by the area between the world price and the supply curve. So what you would see here is the producer's surplus would become a smaller triangle. So in this case, you can see that because of lower price, producer surplus would decrease. So producers lose if the country becomes a importer. Now, what about the total surplus? Well, obviously, it's pretty easy for you to examine the total surplus. So let's compare total surplus. You can see that before opening up, the country's total surplus was given by this. Okay, let me redraw this. It's given by this triangle, right? And after the country opens up, the total surplus is given by this large triangle on the top and this little triangle at the bottom, right? So you can see that there is additional surplus, right? What is this additional surplus? This additional surplus is given by this area, right? This triangle shaded in red, right? So that's the additional surplus. So you can see that total gain exceeds loss. Of course, this is just the case if the country becomes a import. And you could do this, and you could apply the same method to analyze how consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus would change if the country becomes a exporter. Now let's review the third lesson. Should a tariff be part of the new policy? Well, if you recall what we have learned in the last class, you can see that if we evaluate the tariff policy from the perspective of total surplus, you can see that a tariff is never preferred because a tariff, by definition, is a type of tax, right? And this tax, after imposing this tax, price will be higher. And the price with tariff is higher than the world price. And what I can see here is this higher price will distort the market, which means there will be deadweight loss. To be more specific, again, recall what we have learned in the last class, or look at this picture. You can see that the deadweight loss is given by D and E. Sorry, the deadweight loss is given by D and F. And we also have discussed the deadweight loss D is caused by overproduction, and the deadweight loss F is caused by underconsumption. So you can see that this distortion caused by tariff artificially modifies buyers and producers' behavior. and it will actually reduce this country's total surplus. Okay, great. So let's see this quick quiz here. The country autarka does not allow international trade. In autarka, you can buy a wool suit for 100 grams of gold. Meanwhile, in neighboring countries, you can buy the same suit for 60 grams of gold. If autarka was to allow free trade, would it import or export? Well, this is actually pretty easy, right? To decide whether a country will become an import or export, you just need to compare domestic price and the world price. So you can see that here the domestic price is 100 and the world price is 60, which means the world price is lower. So this country should become an import. So it will become a importer. Draw the supply and demand curves for wool suits in the country of autarka. Well, this is just very basic, right? So just draw this curve. In your diagram, what is the change in consumer surplus and change in producer surplus and the change in total surplus? Okay, maybe let me redraw a larger picture. It's hard to find the space here. So supply and demand. This is price. So what is the change in consumer surplus? So let's say this is given by the producers. Let's say this dashed line gives us the domestic price. And then this line gives us the world price, which is 60. And of course, domestic price is 100. Now, the problem says, find out the change in consumer surplus. So we're looking for change. And you can see that consumer surplus change is given by this red shaded area, right? At this stage, you definitely need to be able to figure out why the change in consumer surplus is given by this shape, right? What about the change in producer's surplus? Well, change in producer's surplus is given by this area, right? So this is the change or the reduction or the decrease in producer's surplus. Now, what is the change in total surplus? Well, the change in total surplus is given by this triangle. Let me use a different color. I just use black. Right? The last question is, how did tariff change these effects? Okay, I won't draw the tariff on this very ugly picture. So let's just go back to the lecture note, because this graph is quite complicated. So it's better to use the picture from this lecture note. Once you look at this lecture note, it becomes pretty easy to see what would happen if you impose tariff, right? What you can see here is after imposing tariff, the increase in total surplus becomes smaller. Previously, the increase in total surplus because of international trade is given by this larger triangle. Right? is given by this larger triangle, BDEF. Okay, let me write this down. So the increase in total surplus before imposing tariff was given by BDEF. And then after imposing tariff, the total surplus is given by B. So obviously the components, it is given by B plus E because we have to account tax revenue. So you can see that due to tariff, the portion E and F are missing, right? What about consumer surplus? Again, well, I think it's actually easier to look at these results here, right? You can see that after imposing tariff, consumer surplus decreases. And you could see that producer surplus increases. Again, you could just look at these, you could just look at this table, right? Which actually gives you a quite clear picture on what is happening in this tariff case. Okay, let me move on to this true-false problem. Again, obviously, I don't have true-false problems in the exam, but please just don't ignore these true-false problems because I think they are a fun way to help you to understand class materials and to get some practice. Okay, if the UK imports teacups from the other countries, UK producers of teacups are better off as a result of the trade. But UK consumers of teacups are worse off. So here, the keyword is imports, right? So basically, the country becomes an importer. And we have learned if a country becomes an importer, it basically implies the world price is actually lower. So if the world price is lower, as the country becomes an importer, consumers will be better off and the producers will be worse off, right? So basically for this first true-false question, you should select false. Second, tariffs cause deadweight loss because they move the price of a imported product closer to the equilibrium without trade, then reducing the gains from trade. So this one is actually correct. So you can see that first, reducing the gains from trade is clearly correct. And then what does this mean? They move the price of an imported product closer to the equilibrium without trade. So what is the equilibrium without trade? Well, if you look at the picture here, you can see that it is actually right. So this is the world price. This is the domestic price. Equilibrium without trade refers to this point, right? Because this is the domestic equilibrium when there was no trade. And after imposing tariff, let's say if you impose a $10 tariff, then the price of the international trade would increase by $10. So the domestic price would become this, right? So it would move up by the tariff amount. So you can see that indeed after imposing tariff, the price moves closer to this equilibrium point, that is this point. So this is actually correct. Clearly, to correctly judge whether this is right or wrong, you have to draw this picture and see how the price moves. Right? When a government imposes a tariff on a product, the domestic price will equal the world price. Well, we can actually reuse this picture we just drew, right? You can see that this is not right. So, after imposing a $10 tariff, the domestic price would become world price plus 10, right? So you can see that the domestic price will be larger than the world price. So this is false. If Argentina exports oranges to the rest of the world, the producers are worse off and consumers are better off. This is not right, right? Because if a country becomes a exporter, then it implies the world price is larger than the domestic price without trade. So this implies the producers could actually sell at a higher price and consumers have to pay higher price. So producers would be better off and consumers would be worse off. So this is false. Fifth, if the world price of a product is larger than the domestic price, then the country will become an importer. This is not right, right? Because world price is higher, then the country should start exporting products to the outside world. So this is false. Deadweight loss measures the decrease in total surplus that results from a tariff. This is right, right? This is exactly the definition of deadweight loss. So deadweight loss is always the loss in total surplus because of some policies or some imperfections. So in the context of international trade, deadweight loss specifically measures the decrease in total surplus because of a tariff. If the domestic price of a product is low relative to the world price, the country has a comparative advantage in producing the good. We have exactly a paragraph which talks about this in our lecture note. The answer here is true. Roughly speaking, it's because if you think about supply curve, right? A supply curve basically measures the opportunity cost of producers. So if the domestic price is lower, then it basically means the average opportunity cost or the typical opportunity cost in the domestic market is lower compared with the producers in the outside world. So this implies this country has comparative advantage. Then it should specialize in producing this good and become an exporter. 8. Suppose that Ivory Coast imports wheat at the world price of 4 and it imposes a tariff of 1 and the price of wheat would increase but by less than 1. This is not right. The price would increase by the exact amount as the size of the tariff. So if the tariff is 1 and world price is 4, then the price of wheat in Ivory Coast would be 5. So this is false. 9th, without free trade, the domestic price of a product must be equal to the world price of a good. This is not right because we're discussing the case of no trade, right? So without trade, the domestic price and the world price can definitely deviate because this country is not opening up. And clearly, the correct statement is with free trade, the domestic price must be the same as the world price. So the statement 9 is not correct. Okay, great. So we basically finished chapter 3 and chapter 9. Both centers on the topic of international trade. And chapter 3 is a more like a foundational chapter. So basically we talked about the definition of comparative advantage and specialization, right? So that was the major topic in chapter 3. And based on chapter 3, we could discuss chapter 9 and we could understand from the from more rigorous economic perspective why international trade could benefit a country. You can see that a very important topic in chapter 9 is about analyzing the total surplus from international trade. And the more complicated the case is analyzing the deadweight loss when there is a tariff, right? So make sure you spend some time in understanding this more complicated tariff case. Okay, now let's move to chapter 10. Chapter 10 is about public economics. So we will discuss a very important concept in microeconomics. It's called externalities. It's quite important because first, I think in real life, you can see that externalities or the cases of externalities happen a lot. And second, through understanding externalities, we could understand why do we need government from an economic perspective. Because if you think about this, you will find out it seems that in this lecture until now, we always say market is the best. Market gives us the highest efficiency. And once the government imposes a tax, there is deadweight loss. So it seems that market is the cure-all solution, right? But you wanted to understand if market is so great, why do we need government, right? So through learning externalities, you will see that if there are externalities, market cannot achieve the best outcome. Right? Market cannot give us the highest possible total surplus. And in this case, we do need government to help us to correct these inefficiencies from externalities. So this is a nice chapter which justifies the existence or the necessity of government policies from an economic perspective. Obviously, why government exists is a very complicated topic, and you can justify the existence of government from different perspectives, right? You could talk about it in the economic sense or political sense or sociology sense, right? Clearly, this is an economic course, so we would just want to think about this question from the economic perspective. Okay, great. Now let's first define externalities. So externality is the uncompensated impact of one person's action on the well-being of a bystander. So this definition is a little complicated, right? But don't worry. We will discuss several examples which will give you a very clear idea what is exactly externality. But first, maybe let me first give you some. Okay, let me draw maybe two people, right? So, oops. All right, we have two people here. So let's say the guy on the left is smoking, right? So this is a cigarette. So he is smoking. And you can see that, let's say these two people, they're in the same room. So this guy feels very uncomfortable from the other person's smoking behavior, right? So this guy is uncomfortable because of smokes, right? Now, in this case, you can see that there is externality. Because the guy who is smoking impacts, right? Impacts the other person who does not smoke. However, you can see that this kind of impact is not compensated. It is uncompensated because even the person on the right feels uncomfortable. The person who smokes will not give any compensation to the person who feels uncomfortable, right? The smoker will not give any, let's say, money to the non-smoker, right? So this negative impact from the smoker imposed on this non-smoker is uncompensated. That's why there is externality. And depending on the nature of this impact, we could have negative externality. So obviously, this smoking case, there is negative externality because the person on the left generates negative adverse impact on this non-smoker, right? So smoker generates negative adverse impact on the non-smoker. Of course, there could be positive externalities. That is, a person is generating positive impact, positive benefits to others. However, this person who is generating positive impact is uncompensated. So in this case, there is positive externality. So why do we care about externalities? Well, from the definition, you can see that if there is externality, then how do you define total surplus or total welfare? Becomes subtle, right? Whenever you have externalities, the total surplus or the total welfare includes the welfare of buyers, sellers, and more importantly, the bystanders, right? Because the actions from market participants, the actions of buyers and sellers are affecting standards. So we have to include the welfare of all three parties: buyers, sellers, and bystanders. Now, why this definition of total welfare matters? The reason is because if you think about the transaction in the market, it's very natural for you to imagine that the buyers and sellers, then when they're making decisions on how much to produce and how much to consume, they will not consider their impact on bystanders, right? So this implies that the buyers and sellers' actions are not maximizing total welfare. Or you could say something like this. When buyers and sellers are making decisions, they will just maximize total surplus of buyers and sellers. However, from a social perspective, the best or the purpose is we want to maximize the total welfare of buyers, sellers, plus this third party bystanders. However, buyers and sellers, they will just ignore this third party. So their actions will fail to maximize the total surplus, right? So this basically implies that when there exists externality, when there is this third party bystanders, then buyers, sellers' actions will fail to achieve a efficient outcome. That is, market equilibrium becomes inefficient when there is externality. Now, in this case, the government can actually impose some policy, right? The government can actually use these policies to correct the inefficiencies of the market. So let's look at the following several examples of externalities. Example 1 has been discussed, right? Smoke from cigarettes is a negative externality, and I have explained this. However, you can see that smokers, they will not consider the health hazard to non-smoking bystanders, right? So this basically implies that the smokers, they will smoke too much. They will generate too much smokes, too much health hazard. So in this case, the government can actually use some policy, such as posting some non-smoking signs in public spaces, right, to restrict these smoking behavior. So this would actually reduce the amount of smoke, right? Example 2, the smoke from cars is a negative externality, right? Obviously, as a person who is actually walking, right? You're happily walking from your school to your home, and then a car passes by, a lot of smoke. You would definitely feel unhappy with that, right? However, you won't get compensated. The driver will not give you a dime, right? So this is an example of negative externality. Now, what's the implication of this negative externality? It basically means that because drivers, they don't need to compensate you, or they won't need to pay when their car issues or generates some smokes. So they will actually pollute too much, right? There will be too much smoke from cars. So in this case, you can see that the government can use some policies to reduce the amount of smoke, the amount of pollution from cars. What they can do is, this is also true in reality, right? They could actually set some kind of emission standards for cars, and they could actually tax cars, right? Or they could actually have some EV policy to promote electric vehicles, right? Example 3, barking dogs. So barking dogs create a negative externality, right? So it's again so basically the story goes like this. Let's say I have a barking dog and you're my neighbor, and my dog barks overnight or all night. So you will feel very uncomfortable because you just cannot sleep because of the dog's bark. However, I will not compensate you. You will not get compensated from this barking dog. So this is a case of negative externality. And you can see that the consequence of such negative externality is dog owners, they would take too few precautions to prevent their dogs from barking. So now the government can play some useful role. Let's say the government can address this problem by making it illegal to disturb the peace at night. Wow, we still have some examples. Let's look at the 4th example. So restored historical buildings have some positive externality. Why do these buildings have positive externality? Well, think about this. if you drive along a road and if the road has a lot of old nice buildings, then you would actually feel happy, right? You would actually look at these buildings and you could enjoy these buildings. So this happiness is positive. However, the building owners will not get compensated by you, even you're enjoying these beautiful buildings, right? So historical nice buildings, we have some positive externality. The consequence of this positive externality is because these historical building owners, they won't get compensation from people like you. So they actually tend to discard these older buildings too quickly, right? So in this case, you can see that government can actually step in by regulating the destruction of historical buildings, right? Or they could actually provide some tax subsidies to historical building owners. Now, example 5. It's about research. So research into new technologies provides a positive externality. I mean, generally, education, knowledge, research, they have positive externalities. So because of this positive externality, then inventors tend to devote too few resources to research. And then the government can actually address this problem by using patent system. Basically, if you are an inventor and if you obtain your patent, then you will have this patent right, let's say, for 10 years. So you could actually charge royalties if anyone uses your patent. So in this case, you can see that this will give you the exclusive use of your inventions. So this will provide a financial motivation for inventors to invent new things. We can consider these 5 examples as some sort of overview. I think if you think about deeply, you will have some questions, right? For example, if research has positive externality, why inventors will devote too few resources, right? Why? And you could also ask how exactly government can actually use policies to address these externality problems. Clearly, in these 5 simple examples, we haven't discussed these questions in details. So we will actually move on to talk about at least 2 important questions we just asked. Why too few resources to research if research has positive externality? And how exactly government can regulate externalities, right? Okay, now let's think about the basic case, that is, when there were no externalities. We actually learned about this, right? So let's say we start from a market for aluminum, right? So let's say we are considering this market and we have this supply curve and demand curve. And we learned in previous chapters, if this is a competitive market, then if there is no externality, then the market equilibrium maximizes total surplus, right? It basically says the competitive market outcome is the most efficient one, right? So that's the basic result we have obtained from previous chapters. But now let's think about more complicated case when there are negative externalities. So let's suppose the negative externalities come from the producers, the suppliers, right? Let's say the aluminum factories have some pollution, right? So the smoke from aluminum factories creates a health hazard. This is a negative externality, right? Because basically, let's say you live in a neighborhood which is very close to this aluminum factory, and then you have to smoke this this polluted air. Clearly, you cannot just directly ask for compensation from this factory. Right? The owner possibly will just ignore you. So the first question is, how does this externality affect the efficiency of the market outcome? And a related question is, how would this externality will affect the quantity? You will see that, so let me first give you the answer of this or these two questions. So if there is negative externality, you guessed it, the market outcome is not efficient. And if there is negative externality, the market equilibrium quantity will be too large. So these are the two basic results. Now let's see how could we get this result. Okay. So the key here is to understand if there is negative externality from producers, then we will have two kinds of costs of production. The first is the private cost. The second is the social cost of production. Let me write this down because this is very important. This is the it's like the foundation or the basic element to understand this negative externality example. So cost of production, right? We have two kinds of costs: private cost and social cost. What is the private cost of production? It's just the cost faced by the producer, right? For example, to produce 1 ton of aluminum, the producer has to use a inputs which has a value of $1,000. Then you can see that the $1,000 is really the cost faced by this producer. And what is this relationship between the social cost of production and the private cost of production? Well, you can guess this, right? It's called social cost of production. So it basically means you're thinking about the cost imposed on this whole society, right? And in this context, it means you have to consider both costs. That is, the cost to the firm and the cost to these bystanders who are affected by the pollution, right? So social cost equals private cost plus cost to third-party bystanders, right? Okay. Obviously, you can see that social cost is larger than the private cost. And now we could work on to draw out this this market equilibrium, right? Okay, so you can see that here you have the quantity on the horizontal axis and price on the vertical axis, which is very typical in economics, right? And what you can see here is, let's first look at the demand curve, right? So we have only one demand curve here. And now let's look at the supply curve. We have two different supply curves here. The blue curve is the supply curve which only accounts for private cost. And the red curve is the curve which considers the social cost. Again, you can see that social cost equals private cost to the firm and the external cost to the third-party bystanders. And what you can see here is, well, we have learned about this. Social cost is larger than supply cost, right? This basically means that the red supply curve has to be above the blue supply curve, right? So here the key observation here is really red curve above blue curve. And now you can have this interesting result. That is, you will have two kinds of market equilibrium, right? So this equilibrium, which is the intersection of this demand curve and this private supply curve. This is the market equilibrium, right? You have another. The second one. The second one is given by the intersection of the blue demand curve and the red supply curve. What are these differences? Well, the first equilibrium marked in the red dot is the competitive market equilibrium. And the second equilibrium marked in this blue dot is the social, right? Is the optimal equilibrium. What you can see here is the quantity under this social optimum is actually lower compared with the quantity under the competitive market equilibrium. What does this tell you? It tells you that when you account for social cost, the optimal level of quantity is actually smaller than the quantity produced by the market. So this basically means that the market is producing too much aluminum when there is negative externality. Or you could say that when there is negative externality on this supplier's side, the competitive market will produce too much, right? Okay. Let's see. Now, if you look at these two equilibrium points, you might wonder, hey, how can I improve this market outcome? Well, one thing you could do is you obviously want to move the market equilibrium quantity to this optimum quantity, right? That is, you want to reduce the quantity produced by the market. And later you will see that one way to achieve this is to use tax. You could basically impose tax on this aluminum factory, and its private cost will actually move up, right? And if you properly design your tax, the private cost supply curve will move up and overlap with this social cost supply curve. And then you could achieve this optimum result. Of course, this is for, we have not formally discussed this tax policy. This is just some preview here. Okay. Now let's think about how the total surplus will change, or which case will give you larger total surplus, right? So let's now look at total surplus. Sorry. Let me see how can I proceed with this. I guess I will have to, you know what? I will have to extend the demand curve and the supply curve. And then I will have to draw out these two different prices, and I will follow the. Okay, you know what? I will just directly use this picture because this is quite complicated. So using the picture from the lecture note is a better idea. Okay, now let's compare total surplus under the optimum quantity, that is under this quantity, versus the market quantity, right? Let's compare which quantity gives us larger total surplus. The important thing about calculating surplus with externality is you will want to only use one supply curve, and you will just want to use the social cost supply curve. Again, let me repeat. When you're calculating the total surplus with externality, you will only want to use the social cost supply curve. To some sense, you could actually just ignore this private cost supply curve. Okay. Now let me maybe make this. Let me make this line thicker, right, to emphasize. You should focus on these two thick lines. Okay. Let's ignore. Let's just ignore this line, right? Oops. Okay, let's ignore this. Okay, if you remove this private cost supply curve, then everything becomes much clearer. Okay, now let's calculate consumer surplus. Right? Okay, so let's look at. Let's look at consumer surplus, and we also look at producer surplus, right? So consumer surplus, producer surplus, total surplus. So let's examine these quantities. So let's look at the optimum quantity, right? And we compare our results with Q market, that is the quantity under the competitive market equilibrium. Now, let's see what kind of result we can have here. So when we are looking at this optimum quantity, we can see that consumer surplus is just given by D, right? That's pretty easy. And what about producer's surplus? It's A and E. So total surplus is given by D plus A plus E, right? And what about the consumer surplus under this Q market? Notice that if you're examining the consumer surplus under Q market, you have to also use a different price, right? You have to use this. Okay? So basically, price and quantity are coming in different pairs. That is, okay, let me first again remove this curve. So whenever you're calculating surplus under this optimum quantity, you have to use P optimum, right? And Q optimum. And when you're calculating consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus under this market quantity, you have to also use the market price, right? You have to use this guy, P market and Q market. So again, you can see that quantity and price become in pairs. When you're using Q market, you have to pair Q market with P market. When you're using Q optimum, you have to pair Q optimum with P optimum. Now this looks simple, but in exam, a lot of people would actually get confused. Okay. Now let's look at consumer surplus under Q market. So in this case, you can see that under Q market, the consumer surplus is actually given by let me use a different color. It's given by D, A, and B, and C. Again, you can see that D, A, B, C is the area between the demand curve and P market, right? Now, what about the producer's surplus? This part is super confusing, so you have to be careful. So here, producer surplus is, again, it's the area between the supply curve and the price. What is the price here? It's the P market price, right? So, okay, let me make this clearer. So producer surplus is the area between supply curve and P market. What is the area here? It's the E triangle, right? And the B triangle, C triangle, and H, right? So it's E, B, C, H. These four different triangles represent the area between P market and supply curve. However, you have to pay attention to signs. E is a positive surplus because P market is larger than the supply curve, so it's positive. Remember, producer surplus equals price minus the cost of production. So if supply curve is below the price, then producer surplus is positive. However, if producer surplus is above price, then However, if supply curve is above price, then in this case, producer surplus will become negative because in this case, cost of production is larger than price. So you will have negative producer surplus. So you can see that here you have to use minus B minus C minus H. I would say the most confusing part is calculating producer surplus here. So make sure you spend some time to think about this. Why B, C, H are negative, right? Okay, so what about the total surplus? Of course, it's just the summation of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So, okay, let me see. I think it's A, D, E minus H. No, sorry. It's I think it's A, D, E minus H. Okay. Now let's look at change here. The consumer surplus increases by A and B and C under this Q market. And then producer surplus decreased by minus B minus C minus H minus A. And total surplus decreased by H, right? So what you can see here is, okay, let me remove this shaded area. You can see that there is deadweight loss under this market quantity. Right? What you can see here is the deadweight loss is given by H. Right? Now, how do you understand this deadweight loss? It's actually pretty easy to understand. So this is actually related to what we have discussed in previous chapters. You can see that this Q optimum, this optimum quantity, gives you the largest possible total surplus. So any deviation in quantity from Q optimum will generate deadweight loss. More specific, you can see why there is deadweight loss, which is measured by H. The reason is because you can see that for these producers, right? You can see that the social cost, or the producers on this green section, these producers, their social cost is larger, is higher compared with buyers' willingness to pay, right? Which basically means cost is larger than the benefit. So when these producers and these buyers, they transact with each other, when they trade with each other, the total surplus from their transactions is actually negative, right? However, you can see that in a competitive market, they will still want to trade with each other because the sellers, they don't care about external cost. They only care about private cost, right? That is, if you look at this private cost curve, you can see that from sellers' perspective, because they don't care about external cost. So in this case, consumers' willingness to pay is actually larger than their private cost, right? Again, to summarize, you can see that consumer surplus. Sorry, you can see that consumer, their willingness to pay is below social cost, right? And it's above private cost. So that's why the market deviates from the efficient outcome. It's because as long as willingness to pay is higher than the private cost, trades or transactions will happen between buyers and sellers. However, these transactions are inefficient because in the end, inefficiency is computed by comparing social cost and buyers' willingness to pay. However, unfortunately for these transactions, social cost is larger than willingness to pay. So in the end, you will have this deadweight loss, which is measured by this triangle H. Again, as I said, this example is actually quite complicated. So spend some time to understand how do you compute these consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. And it's even better if you could get a understanding why the deadweight loss is measured by H, right? The economic argument. Obviously, the basic requirement is you have to understand deadweight loss is given by this H, right? Okay, that's for today's class.